This is IBM Museum, and this video has quite a bit of background material, so I'll go over that, and then I've got a demonstration section at the end on this particular system. So I received an email, and this is actually as of yesterday, my time, and thought I'd be able to quickly put together a video on it, but it was from Major Tom. And I'll go through and read this and hide my webcam image as I get to it, and then re-show myself once I get below. And there's I apologize, this text may be kind of small if you're on a regular size display, but as I say, I'll go through and read that. So Major Tom goes through and writes, entitled the Model 30 286, actually, alternative ROM fonts. And he kind of addresses it to a particular group that should be informed of this. But he says, while poking inside the 30-286 firmware, I noticed some additional fonts. VILE-R is a step ahead and already has a preview and some info here, and gives a link. I'll give the link in the video description as well. We're referring to a, in fact, I'll go through. Let me give the browser capture and hide the image for a moment. But this is the INT10 hex website that VILE-R, the moniker, has gone through and given quite a bit of details, especially on the fonts that can be on the system. And that included that earlier video, of course, that I had the 8086 base Model 30 that for that early revision 00 BIOS. It was some months ahead, several months ahead of the PS2 being the introduction date of the PS2s. And it had a different font that was later changed with other BIOS revisions. But it was kind of neat to kind of see that. And VILE-R did have an area as well for that. You can go through, I can probably link in that older video, because that was kind of some cool information. But he went through and he found some fonts starting with the Model 30 286, and that includes also the Model 25 286. It was an all-in-one unit. The Model 30 286 and the Model 25 286 shared the same planers. There was a couple planers, and I'll go into that when I give a little bit of the demonstration details. That has some fonts in the ROMs. The BIOS ROMs that for the system, and goes through, and of course on here, saying that they're all rather nondescript. They're just some alternate fonts. Not aware of any software that actually use them. They're not documented, and the video BIOS code doesn't seem to reference them. So such software is unlikely to exist. In other words, it's just a piece of code on these BIOS chips that could have been utilized, could have been planned for at one point, and just was never utilized. And there's some good demonstrations of the fonts there. But let's get back to Major Tom's information here. And all 5 fonts are 8x16 points, 4 KB in size, and are located at the following offsets. The E00, the E, well, it's an E segment starting at an offset of 8F00, 9F00, AF00, and BF00 within that E segment. And but this is true only for the original BIOS release, revision 0, dated 25 August 1988. The offsets are different in other known build, revision 2, dated 28 June 1989, but more on that later. Now, VileR is right that the BIOS doesn't reference these additional font sets anywhere, in parentheses, not, or at least not in revision 0. But the comment about software availability isn't quite correct. If you check the 3286 star diskette, you'll find two curious files, font select or sel.com and fontmanager.sys. There's also a README file attached that Thomas attaches here to this email that explains how to use them. Now, I'll go through and let's read on, I guess. But as expected, it doesn't talk about the inner workings. So here we go. Let me pause at that point. The reference here is that, and I just have to switch between my sources here. Okay, so the browser capture on, image off. So on VileR's site, the page that references these alternative fonts, the talks about the later PS2 models, including the 25SX, had a was another all-in-one unit, had a 386SX unit. You've seen videos on that on my channel. The 35SX and also the 40SX use the same planar as the 35SX. So when you see the 35SX, the reference for the 40SX is the same. The 35SX was a space saver, quote, space saver design that was a 3x3, 3 bays, 3 slots, 3 adapter slots. The 40SX was a 5x5, 5 drive bays, 5 adapter slots. That can differ on what IBM calls a bay, but typically they use the reference of 3x3 or 5x5. And the tower considered, 8x8 or whatever, 8 adapter slots, whatever amount of bays, be it 5 or depending on the model of the PS2 and other series of IBM systems. So on these later, even the later BIOS for the 3286 and the model 2526, those alternative fonts have some other things that have been added to the BIOS, and they're displaced. They're offset from where they were supposed to be by a certain amount. And what Major Tom will go through and explain is that offset is not planned for or predicted. These are probably already forgotten about by the time that later BIOS revision hit, that it was a utility or anything like that. And especially so for the later PS2 models that also had these in ROM, that they still had an offset of where they're supposed to be. And the utilities that are on that model 3286 start up diskette or starter diskette it's unable to work with those times that those fonts are offset from the addresses they're designed to be. And also, it's only on that startup diskette for the PS2 Model 3286. It's not even on the startup diskette for the PS2 Model 2586. Viewed as identical, it has the same, utilizes the same planers and things like that, would have had the same features for that BIOS revision. And the utilities themselves go through and they actually check for that they're running on a Model 2526 or a Model 3026. They don't check the BIOS revision, and we'll look at that a little bit in the demonstration. So back to the email, and I have to look to see if I'm far enough down. Okay. And yeah, I may have to hide my internal webcam just for a bit here as continue reading. And so Font Manager says, oh, and I could have done this as well. You get me warts and all for the way that I present stuff. Let's go through for the text box here. This is the README file that's included on that startup diskette for the PS2 Model 30-86 that Major Tom references there. And people, if the can read that, if the text is big enough for them on their displays that they're using, I'll include that text in the video description. It's going through to where Major Tom is going to explain all that anyway of how these are utilized. So we will go through and let's get the image display back up. And I'll get my built-in webcam just off the screen for just a moment here. Font Manager Sys is a simple driver that, when loaded, builds a modified video parameter table and points the VPD address in BDA to this structure. But on its own, the driver doesn't give you an option to actually switch to the other alternative fonts. It contains just one hard-coded font address that in the E segment, that 9F00 by default, pointing to the second alternate font. And the switching is done from the fontselect.com utility that lets you select one of the 5 fonts using a simple dialog box. The binary contains all 5 offsets, selects the appropriate one, and then writes the new value to the font manager.sys driver binary. A rather unusual approach, to say the least. And Major Tom references to points of particular comment to VIAL-R. The utility also reveals the names of the 4 fonts. Here is how the names map to the individual fonts offsets for the revision 0 image. In other words, just an update to how they're identified on VIAL-R's site. The standard font being at that, in the E segment, at that 8F00 hex, the 9F00 hex offset being for the elite, and in parentheses is how VIAL-R is identifying them on the site, on his site. The offset of AF00 being actually named Oak 8 and being identified on VIAL-R's website as Alt 2. the offset of BF00 being identified as OAK9 and as Alt3 on VileR's website. And then at offset CF00, the sans serif being identified as Alt4 on VileR's website. And both the utility and the driver require DOS 3.30, and that's the version that the PS2s came with anyway. Right at the introduction of April 1987 is when DOS 3.3 came out. And so that is especially for the supporting the 3.5-inch diskette formats from DOS 3.3, that is a requirement for those systems. Minimum DOS for the PS2s is DOS 3.30. So, and both machines both check for machine model FC Hex, which is a 286 base IBM system, and submodel 09, value shared by the model 3026 and 2526. Major Tom's doing a very good write-up for this. Both components were programmed by Alan E. Belitz and built, I hope I'm getting that name pronounced correctly, and built on the 8th of July, 1988, according to the strings in the binaries. And I've gone through and looked up that individual, and who knows, to see this video, we would love to hear some background. I know that that Alan spent some time at Dell. There are a number of patents to his name, and that would be great if my video is viewed enough to go through, and if any memories of this process are still there, it'd be great. I mean, it's a minor footnote as it is kind of production, but just as Major Tom says, just one of those neat things about PS2s that still keep you involved, that all these things, these fonts just lurked in that ROM BIOS and later on kind of got pushed off to the side and forgotten about, but you know, pieces of them were there. And we'll see that in the demonstration. The files are missing from the 25 to 86 star disk. That's why I said is it's only on the Model 30 to 86 starter diskette, and which I'm working from on the system that's behind me, or at least from the available version, which is version 1.0 dated 28 March 1990 is the startup diskette for the MUL 25 to 86. It's possible that they removed them because of the issues I've described below, and we will get in detail. I've kind of mentioned this out of order a little bit. As I mentioned before, the font offsets are different for the revision 2 BIOS dated 28 July 1989. I think this is a bug. There's probably a filler padding of a fixed length between the previous BIOS block and the font block. And the question why to put the fonts at some nice round address, giving the example of 8F00 for the offset of where it is in that segment, and to reserve some space between the two blocks for future updates. That way the BIOS code can grow like it did in revision 2, and the fonts can stay in the same place. But this only works if you recalculate the filler length before assembling the image, something that probably didn't happen here, and caused the font data to move by positive 133 hex, which is 307 bytes decimal. And this could be easily fixed, but it's probably not worth it. though I have to admit that I don't have the revision 2 image fully reversed, and so it's possible that there is a table of offset somewhere in the ROM. I think it's rather unlikely. And we're going to test it. We're going to empirically test this as well. It would also require an updated font switcher, which is something I don't see on the 25, 26, 25SX or 35/40 starter diskettes. But then again, I didn't analyze every single binary. So it just appears the utilities are on that startup diskette for the PS2 model 30-86. And just that the utilities have only the ability to work with the fonts on the ROMs for that BIOS revision 0 and not the later BIOS revision 2. I haven't found a revision 1. It probably was skipped by IBM as well, not released in the wild. But we're going to look at that empirically as well. And the fonts are shifted even further in the MUL 35/40 and 25SX firmware builds. It was likely used very rarely and probably forgotten about by then, even by the developers. Please note that I have done a static analysis. I've not tried running the binaries on real hardware. It would be interesting to see this in action and get some empirical data on this. Bam. I'm there. And that's why the next note is directed at me. You want to give this a try, copy both binaries to the same directory, add the fontmanager.sys driver to your config sys, run font select to select the font, and then reboot. And it should work correctly on the MUL 30/86 and MUL 25/86 with the revision 0 BIOS. If it doesn't, check the BIOS revision, which makes sense. So it should run on revision 2 as well, but it will more than likely produce completely garbled fonts since the font data has moved. And that is going to be demonstrated as well. I'm going to get to the, now that I've finished reading that, we're just over 20 minutes into, and I'm going to go through and I'll hide the README text. I mean, that's helpful for going through and setting this up as well. Giving instructions. And so let me turn that off to get to the machine and kind of explain what I've done here. I don't think that there'll be a little bit any more reading, so I can take the reading glasses off. And I will probably get spun around at some point. But I have this startup menu, and I don't have a default and timeouts. I tried putting that in, and I'm not getting the syntax correctly. But I have here a startup menu because I've got MS-DOS 6.22 on this particular drive, and it just ended up being what I used, what I had at hand. I need to test some other drives. I had a box full of a few drives that looked like that was the bad drive box for the Model 30 and Model 25 proprietary hard drives that those use. But I did get one of them working. I had it labeled some masking tape on there that it doesn't boot, that I had to boot from a diskette, and that it hangs. And I actually figured out it's the configuration that was on the drive. AutoExec.bat, what it called, and that was giving it grief. But I set up this with that menu structure without running the font manager as the first selection for a particular reason, as a way to bail out. Because if you go through and you change the settings on your hard drive this way, if you get something that's not being able to display, to be displayed correctly, then it makes for a hard time again. I mean, you'd otherwise normally have to pull out a boot diskette and go through and boot from that diskette and then get over to the hard drive to correct what you're wanting to do. And of course, the second option there is running font manager. And so I'll show the entries in config sys and stuff like that at some point here. This drive is actually fairly minimal on the DOS version, even though it has MS-DOS 6.22, which satisfies that requirement. It has to be at least DOS 3.3. And I mean, that's the oldest DOS version for PS2s anyway, that is required for supporting the features of the PS2. So let me go through. I'll get off the webcam here. Now, I want people to notice the placement within the screen too of the menu and that left-hand edge in particular. It's not up against that left-hand margin of my capture screen. Get switched over to my camcorder, and looks like the display is sitting a little bit low. I have my lips available to be lip read if necessary. I'm not sure what kind of subtitles that Google will do automatically, but in the background here, and I went through and tested this on my background display that has a 4:3 aspect ratio, and in the video capture, that's why I have it. That's why it's more in the center of the screen. It's actually for a 4:3 aspect ratio that's represented on the video capture as well. And that's important because we don't want to stretch the fonts. If I were to go by that 16:9 ratio, it would go through and it would stretch along the horizontal axis, which is what we don't want to do in this instance, because that distorts the font from how we want to display and how it shows up. Now I've gone through. I do have DOS diskettes that I used to boot up this initially to get into the hard drive and to go through and work with things. So I could have put a more full DOS installation on the system. I probably would have complained. I would have had to see, because I'd probably have to wipe the drive to go and revert back. This is DOS 6.22 on this drive, and I've got the diskettes handy for MS-DOS 6.21. And all the stuff that Microsoft introduced, it'll complain wrong version if you even attempt, if it's even one step off of what those utilities check. Now, this is a system that I had. I went through and it was set aside. This is the one that was trying that CPU stacking. I had the Kingston 386 Now module in there, and I was even stacking a Texas Instrument 46 SLC CPU on top of it, and that turned out horribly wrong. And I've gone through. That's part of the reason I have the postcode reader and things like that set up here as well. I killed it. And this is one of the nice modules. It's the 33 megahertz. I might see about even replacing that 386SX chip, even though it's 33 megahertz, and seeing if I can maybe solder in one of those 486 SLC chips and kind of see how cool that would be. See if I'm able to get this board operating again. I hope I didn't kill any of the other chips, but this board doesn't respond. The postcode reader doesn't turn over when this is in place. And we all learned that the postcode reader, if you don't have video, that's very helpful in giving the codes, so you know that the CPU at least is trying to do something. So this is set aside to be fixed. Now, I didn't, this is a 286 system, and this is a what they call a plastic leaded chip carrier for the 286. And that would have meant it's extraction tool if there had been a 286 CPU instead of these modules. And also, I mean, I could have put a 286 CPU in there. I've got a few of those around, but it was real easy. I had my Intel, the same effective module, the slower speed, handy, that I just dropped it in for a basic CPU rather than having to try and pull a 286 CPU. And those sockets are not designed for insertion and extraction a whole bunch. When I was going through and testing these CPUs years ago, just pulling them in and out of the sockets, I mean, those sockets crack pretty quick. And I could go through, I've got some planers, so I need to replace the sockets and even get 286 CPUs or whatever I'm going to end with those modules back in place. Now, I had to go through, I've got the Dallas clock, the RTC modification. This is one of the mods I have, just putting some wires off to the side with the external battery in a holder, putting it out there where it doesn't contact anything with that metal body of the battery or anything like that. And the Model 30-286, in addition to the planers that are in the Model 25-286, that CPU socket is very close to the Dallas module, and there is some modification that have to be done. On like the 55SX, it doesn't even have the Dallas module close by there. I run this 2-wire cable up and have it, the battery, the external battery, in another section. And the same thing could be done here. You just can't have an external battery holder on the top of that may interfere somewhat with the CPU or a module like the Intel or Kingston that goes on top of that. And so that's just the modifications I did for that. I do have a spare, diskette drive adapter. I haven't tested that works. I have my go-to diskette drive, but I did already have a drive on this unit, even had the startup diskette. This is the Model 30 startup diskette, orange color. As you know me, it's unmarked. I don't have a sticker identifying on it, and I need to go through and do that. So that was already in place because I was just so despondent on the system of breaking something of that module. I just set it aside, and in this instance, I went through and had to search all my Model 30-286s. Now there's the 2 planar variants. This has the 40-pin ROM chip, and that is a later version of the planar. They went through and just unified the contents of that earlier that were on the 2 ROM chips interleaved into that 40-pin ROM. And when I went through searching all my Model 30-286s around, I kept finding the revision 2 BIOS. And only I could go through and complain about having a later BIOS than what I wanted. I wanted to do to find a system with the revision 0 BIOS. I could even non-functional system that I could go through, or non-functional components I could even swap in to the system to be able to demonstrate these utility. Now, I didn't end up finding one. But the image is on the Ardent tool. In fact, I can go through. I'll include the link. In fact, it's probably real helpful to bring that up for me to get turned around and get on the screen again this way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to change the browser capture. And I'll have to work with it a little bit here too. Okay, so browser capture, and we'll paste that in. Okay, and let's go through and do the browser capture. This is just based on how OBS wants to display a page. I'm going to have to get to our interact with it as well. this will be fine because we'll just, realizing that the scroll bar is at the bottom of the interact window I have. Let's get down to the section that I wanted to go. Oh, it's down too much, a little bit too much. Okay, that's about right. Okay, so over on the left, kind of middle of the screen, there is there's the image for that, and I thought that there's not going to be more reading. That 27F4092, and that's on the 40-pin EEPROM. That's identified over on the right as the revision 0 BIOS in that 40-pin ROM package, and it lists even the common chips that are found. In my case, it was I had ended up with an AMD 27C1024 ROM chip, and I didn't find a revision 0, so I thought, well, the image is on the Ardent tool. Let's go through the ROM. The label on top of the ROM chip was faded. I can't even make out, and I had to even that's why the system is on the bench. I had to fire it up to find out what BIOS revision it was, and found out it was revision 2, and I'm like, oh, okay. But the label was so faded that I thought, well, and it's a label over the windows. So I went through and I did snap some shots. I'll probably do a post on Twitter just to show some of the intermediate steps and everything else that I did. I went through and erased it because I know I had that image on other chips, and programmed it with the revision 0 BIOS. And I even prompted Major Tom, where did this image come from? And he's saying it had to come from me. Maybe it was a spare planer or something. And I said, yeah, it must have been some planer I have around somewhere that I wasn't able to locate now. I didn't have any spare 27C1024 ROM chips around, so I had to erase that one and reprogram it. But I'm able to do that with the link to the Ardent tool and the chip, even plural chips types that I needed. I mean, that's shown there in that table. I'll include that link where those ROM images are, that you can grab those images and put them on chips and use that to either even backtrack on the system and test out an earlier ROM, or if you have a PS2 with an older ROM, BIOS ROM version, that you can go through and program the chips and put them in there. And of course, we've got backup copies of what we found, but make sure if you have a version, if you find a version that's not listed on that table, and we're still filling a lot of the different models and things, but contact us because we can tell you how to capture that data. You don't even need an EEPROM reader most of the time for the older PS2 systems. There's a possibility of a programmer or a debug script going through and being able to capture the BIOS image that you have if you've got a unique version that we don't know about. So back to the system I have behind me, the MUL 3286. I have gone through enough of the preliminary information, and we can look at this. I can go through and actually switch from this camera view to the video capture quite easily on my remote here with my clear to click or my clear click device in the background there that does video capture. And some of this is superfluous, where we have the postcode reader and things like that I use to get the system running. So actually, rather than me hiding my webcam image, let's get switched over to the video capture. I think I can be on screen for a lot of this. There may be a section that I may have to just temporarily hide my image just to show you can see the full screen details. Now, for this selection of without running Font Manager, we're not going to use this for now. I use this as a backdoor, no pun intended, of a recent comment I made on YouTube to just be able to get out of any changes that are on the hard drive without having to revert to a boot floppy or something else to back up those changes. So what we will do in this case is we'll select that running font manager, and you have the config sys areas. And you can also do this if you had a later MS-DOS version, you have the ability to go through for the F5 and bypass as long as you press that button at the right time in the boot up process. Typically after the starting MS-DOS, you've got to hit it within just that split second after that and going through, and that would be able to avoid running the config sys. We are, in this case, I'm going through and I'm already loading. And the one thing I don't have is I don't have the edit program on here. I don't even have debug on here for this minimal DOS installation on this. And this is not my doing. This is how I received this drive at whatever point, wherever I received it. But we're going to go through and we're going to look at I can at least do the type command. I don't have access to the more command for something that's longer and than what I'd be able to display in one screen. But here's my config sys just in the menu items that you saw. And the main critical point is that test font entry, which you just selected, runs this device equals C:\font_manager.sys. And that is the reason that it displays that banner up above, that IBM PS2 Mol 30 286 Font Manager version 1.00, copyright IBM Corporation 1988. And it just lets us know that that's resident on the system. I'm able to go through and work with it. So actually, I've made the changes. I don't have to go through and follow through that reboot process now that I've gone through and add that to my config sys. Once the config sys has that in place and you've rebooted the machine to acknowledge that changes, and you get that banner on your screen booting up in the same circumstance. So in a directory, I've added some files. I went through for there's the font manager.sys, and we'll look at the date and time for that, even though I copied that over to the system, because what Major Tom is actually saying is that it goes through, and when you run the utility, that font select utility, it actually changes that font manager.sys file that you're loading in config sys. So that time and date should change as well. So what I've seen though is it goes through and it changes the font. Let's go through the demonstration. And so this is running that font select com program, and that's on the startup diskette for the Mol 3286. You copy these two files over from that diskette to your hard drive. I mean, if your hard drive is the one that you're using, that you want to interface to, that you don't want to go through and boot to your hard drive and insert the diskette drive, it's not going to work because you need that font manager in a defined location so you can link to it from your config sys file when you boot. But that goes through and it puts up a pop-up. And we're on the standard right now, the 5th entry. And we have the other selections. And of course, we see the down to the bottom for the duration that the pop-up is on the screen. That's just a blinking cursor down below. But we can use the arrow key. And also, a matter of in that README text, it explained you can do escape. If you see the selection you have, you can do escape to get out of this dialog box as well, being on the screen. But we're going to go through probably for in fact, we're set to standard right now. So I'm going to do escape just to demonstrate, hey, I can get out of that, returns me to the command prompt. And I'm going to run another program I put on here and got the link from Valar of an old utility that says, what can I use to display the character set easily? Remember on that Model 30 BIOS with the early MCGA font, I just went and dropped into ROM Basic, running that BIOS version, and from there. But this it has DOS implications. You're loading a DOS device driver from config sys. You need to remain in DOS. I can't just simply drop in ROM Basic on this machine and do the same thing. And there's more examples of this from here. But I'm going to run this character set, and that just displays the characters of that particular set for the font that's in place. Okay, and that gives roughly a screen of information. I'll briefly hide my webcam picture, and I'll do this for each of the steps just to show what comes on the screen for this. And I'm doing this from a 4:3 aspect ratio, so that this shouldn't be stretched in any way. This should be as these fonts were intended to be displayed. It's got some text there. The Quick Brown Fox jumped over the lazy dogs. I'll include the link to this, although it's an FTP directory structure at that other end. And you'll need, you can't use Chrome. You'll have to use Firefox or Edge, something in the case that still allows you to do FTP from your browser, if that is the case. But it shows all these nice little fonts, even the control characters in that upper right-hand corner, that you can pause at whatever point to go back to. I realize that my webcam view is kind of hiding over that corner in this instance. But this gives the biggest presentation on the screen at the right aspect ratio without too much adjustments otherwise, other than me just hiding the webcam image if I need to here. So that's what it looks like with that standard. Now, if we go through, and I was just observing that, arrow keys, arrow in left here to select the sans serif, and sans serif is without serifs, Latin, and the serifs being the little ticks and points off of a font style. We'll get to maybe see that in the display because we'll select the sans serif, and it clears the screen and puts us at a different looking command prompt. And there's not any, this font is effectively loaded for all I can see at this point. We'll make sure of how it appears on the screen and demonstrating that presentation. I can go through and hide the internal webcam. And I'll go through for this first step. I mean, people can look at it here. This would be very apparent. And you still have the device driver loaded in config sys is the thought that even if I do a reboot, power down the system, whatever, Control-Delete for warm boot, And of course, I go through and I have to select the right menu item to load that font manager. I should have gone through and tried to set a default of loading the font manager and then it timing out if I didn't get to the screen quick enough. I mean, that could bail out at another point. But this is going through, and it actually had that startup font from before the device driver was loaded from configsys, the generic font, and then it's now switched here. This looks the same as what I was seeing with the command, the prompt before, but going through and showing that character set again, I can go through and hide my webcam. If we go through and do the font select, let's go to the Elite and enter. Gone through and it's cleared the screen once again. And there is the view there. In fact, you can now see even the serifs being back in the lettering, and that is a looks to be a smaller sized font with the way that it's showing on the screen. I mean, that's easy on the eyes as it is. Maybe that's what all the elite people use. I don't know. I'm not elite. Let's go for the font select utility. Let's go to the Oak 8. Okay. We will do the character set. And I'm still wanting to make sure that these are displayed differently. That does look different to me. Without a reboot, just going through, it clears the screen. It seems to go through and load the font. Let me go through and hide my internal webcam so you can go through and see even those control characters in the upper right. We have that, even the math symbols there. If you look at the superscripts and all sorts of cool stuff that through the drawing characters on this page. And we will go through for the font select to go to the Oak 9. And notice whenever this dialog box comes up, it shows the font that is currently in place. And it will clear the screen. If it wouldn't go through and clear the screen, I mean, or there may be ability with the for the people on YouTube to go through and quickly jump between one scene or the other in these sets to show them. Being very helpful. But there is the other Oak font. And it's very evident here, like I say, again, without a reboot, to go through and do the font select, going back to standard. Okay. And that being a font that we are, and that we saw before, that we're very used to. Showing there. So that's the kind of the rundown of showing these fonts. Kind of cool. This stuff is just hidden away, and so exclusive to that revision 0 BIOS and then just got forgotten about and got that image got corrupted, the offset of those fonts later on, and the utility just not able to use them. Let's go through and let's check that out. So I'm going to go through, in fact, let's get switched back to the HDMI of the camcorder, power down the system, and I'm going to go through for this. I probably won't have to disturb too much, but I have to go through and take the riser support out to get the riser out of there. And let's go through and we're going to pull the power. I just don't want to go through, don't want to have anything broken during this. And I have my tool used in this case to get, it's got a little bit of a nice little bend on that end to go through and to get the CPROM out. In fact, I need to mark it with the version. And at least, and what you'll encounter too, that if these are set in the sockets for a long time, there is a, it just has a dissimilar metal. Sometimes it really just bonds in the socket and you have to really gently work it free. But this is what I used is the revision 0 BIOS. You can see on there that label, if anybody can make out the, let me get to where you guys aren't seeing a phase difference and I'm on the screen fully. I mean, if you can see identifier on that label, you have better eyesight than me. And I tried even flash photography and things like that. And ultimately, I know now that I've tested it. But I just went through, since it was not a one-time programmable, you know, it's actually an EEPROM. And there is the die inside. And you have to actually expose these to UV light. You just can't set these out. It's, you know, it's got to be in direct sunlight for a time without being through window glass for for the UVA and UVB. But we've got that label back in place. And then this is the one-time programmable or mask ROM. Just means one image. These are, you know, there's not the ability to go through an array. So you can see why I selected that ROM there, that EEPROM. And this has got the FRU. I don't know why I'm getting reflections and maybe the chip's just shiny. But you can see the FRU, that 33F5540, denoting, and it's marked by IBM copyright of 1988, 1989. And so that's able to be looked up on the ROM image page to get an idea. Even if you don't even have to have a functional machine, you say, hey, I got a 3286. You go through and you look up that FRU, and bango presto, you know the version that is. And if you encounter any FRUs or versions, BIOS versions that we do not have in that table, it would be good to contact us. You want to check orientation. Pin 1 is to my left. As I look at it. And we've got that ROM, that OTP ROM in there now. We can go through, we'll get the riser. Any IBM system that has a riser, you want to run the system with the riser in place, even for testing diagnostic. You want to go through. You don't necessarily have to put support brackets or anything else unless they're really needed, but you want to have the riser in place because there can be information that the system needs as it goes through and runs, and it checks that it can go through, and that riser can make a difference between what model number the system thinks it is, and there's loopback pins and things like that on those. So we get the power connected, get the riser in place. Just going double through and double checking, never hurts. Pin 1 orientation being you got the chip seated and everything. And we're going to go through, get powered on. We'll get back to the VGA capture. And we're seeing this from the boot up sequence before the driver is loaded, of course. So we're seeing, some. And remember that I left this at the standard setting. Okay, so we get to our menu. That's fine. Haven't loaded any of the font manager yet from config sys. So let's go through running font manager, and bam, that's you have a corrupted, and this is from those font images being offset in the utility just doesn't know where to find them. It just tries to display where it thinks they should be and fails. And you can see a little bit of the text as it is for how it does. Now I can go through and blindly type like the font select utility, FONTSEL, to run that utility. And that gives us the pop-up, and it shows that we're on that last entry. We saw the little pop-up before. We can go through and we can arrow around the same way, but going through and the selection of any of these fonts with the revision 2 BIOS is corrupted. There's no other instance but the revision 0 BIOS for both the Model 2526 and Model 3026. Exclusive to those systems because everything is off kilter in every other instance otherwise. If it's not fixed, if somebody hasn't gone through there and, corrected like in this modern age, and as Major Tom says, what would be the point? Kind of having that cool factor or whatever else, but there may be, who knows, could be an attempt at writing that stuff, going through and making a revision 3 BIOS or something else. The utility doesn't check for the BIOS revision. It tries to run in this case and it fails. So that's brought us back. It's cleared the screen and bought that, this is the command prompt as it is. But it's unrecognizable to us. And otherwise, what's supposed to be a blank screen filled with these whatever characters that it's got here. And that's why I built in that backdoor that I can just simply Control-Delete. I don't even need to go through and power it off, power it back on. It's going to bring up that menu once again. And I'll go through, I want to go through and play a little bit more with these fonts. Otherwise, we see the text come up for the menus, and we've got that first selection without running Font Manager, and it gives us a C prompt. And we can go through, and since that is not loaded, and if we see the Font Manager sys, that time frame on that file has changed since we originally started, and that's changed with each successive time that we've gone through and monkeyed with things. And we can do the character set, And we're back effectively to the way that this would appear without that driver, without any looking at the alternate fonts, the Model 30 286 configuration. And I did put on one other utility. I'm just looking at, I'm over an hour on the recording time. That's fine. Sometimes we have times like this. But I did put on one other utility on here, and that is the Parkhead. I had a video of the Model 60 MFM drive that I talked about parking the heads on those. This is also critical for this vintage. This is a 20 megabyte MFM drive, ultimately on the small. The proprietary drives are old, as old as systems, and many of them failed. I need to go through and test what other drives I have, but that also gives that dialog box. It's a good place for an outro. That the heads are parked. And I can go through and power down the system. Let's leave it up. Let's leave it on for the outro. So if you enjoyed the video, thought this whole convoluted way I went through and tried to explain things in a straightforward manner, Tom did an excellent write-up on it. Click on that like button, please. And there'll be links in the video. I'll go through and everything I promised for people looking over this information out there. And I ride on the shoulders of giants. All I'm doing here is I'm empirically demonstrating this stuff. I wasn't the discoverer of this, and that credit needs to be recognized as well. I'll give a link to his website, to the contents that we're looking at, where these alternate fonts are listed, and those may be updated a little bit. That information may be updated a little bit just to put the correct names and stuff like that in place. And then I'll link to where we have the ROM images and other things. And big shout out to Major Tom for that discovery. I mean, he went through where VAL-R, what he found, and then took it a step further and said, hey, let's look into, is there a utility on the starter diskette is what may have possibly used these, and discovered those parameters outside, as we just saw empirically tested, only the revision 0 BIOS of the Model 2526 and the Model 3286. And that's just unfortunate for all this exciting content otherwise. And if you want to see more exciting content like this, subscribe to my channel, please. I always like to see a little bit of support out there. I do have links, just the ability to throw me a couple things, and sometimes it's very needed. I'm not going to dissuade anybody that wants to do that, and that keeps me going as well, and helps support the channel and the content that I provide. And I realize we're on an international stage. I'm the U.S. piece of that, and both VAL-R and Major Tom are not in the United States. I'd love to share the wealth for them doing all this stuff, finding all these neat little things, but I don't know. I'm not even monetized any level on YouTube, so it'd just be people chipping in. We could find a way, if anybody wants to do that too, to thank them as well. And I do want to give them credit. But that's all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.